So this video is going to be introduction to your hip hinge. The video will take you through the purpose, look at an assessment tool that you can use, then take you through some movement adaptations and finish off with some key takeaways. The purpose of a hinge is firstly to strengthen the grip, hips, hamstrings and back. In terms of muscular development, this can occur through hinges around the glutes and hamstrings. And then in terms of a functional pattern that we perform in our day-to-day life, what the hinge can allow us to do is to reach down and pick things up, whether they be heavy things or whether that be repeated motions. So for example, if we're doing something like gardening or moving things around that are low. So the hinge becomes quite a fundamental movement for us in our day-to-day life. And essentially what can happen is if we don't learn to hinge well and we start to hike from or hinge from the back as opposed to from the hips, is we can start to get these repetitive back strains, which are so common in a lot of people's lives. So now looking at the assessment for the hinge, we're going to start out with what's called a 5-1 good morning. So for this, ideally you're going to need a stick, okay? If you don't have one, you can just place the hands on the back of the head. So once you've got your stick, or if you place your hands on your back of your head, the reason why it's called a 5-1 good morning is because you're going to perform 5 seconds lower and then 1 second back to the top. We'll perform 5 reps from the front and the side, and from there we're going to go through a checklist which will allow us to see if we're performing the movement effectively and see if any errors are occurring. So the 5-1 good morning, essentially what we want to do is get into a nice tall position. The feet want to be about hip width, if not slightly inside. Okay, from there, the stick's going to be resting on the tops of the shoulders. And from here, we're going to try and sit our weight back, keeping our chest up, gaze forwards, and then push through the floor to stand up. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the way down, 1 to stand up. Okay, so for a couple from the front. As I'm doing this on the way down, I'm thinking about sitting my weight back. On the way up, I'm thinking pushing through the floor, so especially that big toe, pushing the big toe through the floor in order to drive the hips through into that top position. Noticing as well the chest and the head are nice and upright throughout the movement. So what we're looking for when performing the 5-1 good morning is first of all hip displacement. So essentially in a hinge, what we're trying to look for is the hips going back and forth, back and forth. That's our hip hinge, okay? This is kind of the opposite to a squat, where in a squat we're more looking for the weight going up and down. In a hinge we're looking for it to go backwards and forwards. So the first thing we're looking out for our checklist is going to be our hip displacement. So we're making sure that as we're performing the hinge, we're really working on angling on the center of the hips, we're watching them travel back and then travel forwards again. The second in the checklist is going to be our knee position. Okay, so really common in the hinge, what can happen is the knees can either travel forwards as we try and sit our hips back. What can essentially happen is people can start to bring the knees and bring the legs into it a little bit more when essentially we're trying to really emphasize the loading through the hips. Another thing that can happen that's really common and a little bit more subtle is actually as we hinge, the knees end up traveling back. And then what then happens is we just lose that control through the floor. We might become quite unstable, but also we don't really feel like we've got that nice engagement through the floor. The hips don't feel quite as active if the knees travel all the way back. Okay, so the two things looking out for with the knees are, 1, are they traveling forwards? 2, are they traveling back? Because essentially what we want the knees to be doing is staying directly above the ankles. Okay, so they don't want to be traveling forwards or backwards. It's the hips that are moving. The knees want to be staying over the ankles throughout the movement. The third checkpoint is going to be bar path. Okay, so this specifically applies when the bar's down here. What we want to be seeing is a straight line happening with the bar. So if we were to draw a line vertically from the floor through the center of my foot, we want to be looking for that bar to be traveling along that line. Okay, so it's not shifting forwards, it's not shifting back, it's staying along that line as we perform the hinge movement. And the final checkpoint we're looking for is our trunk position. So as discussed when I was talking you through the movement, we want to be keeping the trunk and the chest upright. I know that sounds kind of contradictory because we're obviously hinging forwards, but we don't want to be dumping and sort of stooping ourselves forwards as we do that. We want to be keeping our trunk nice and braced, okay, in this slightly extended position. I'm looking forwards, the chest is up, and then from there, the hips sit back, but I maintain that nice trunk position as I perform the hinge. Okay, what you'll sometimes see is people having quite a tough time to get into that position. Okay, and that's obviously what we're watching out for with that checkpoint. So if you go through them 4 checkpoints with your 5-1 good morning, and you're able to give them all a nice tick, what we can then start to look at is moving on to the next assessment. Okay, so the first assessment is going to be our good morning. This is quite simple, the bar stays in the same position. The second one is getting slightly more complex, and the bar's now going to be down and being held in our arms. So the second assessment is now going to be hinging to the knees. So we're holding the stick or the PVC pipe, which I've got here, and we're going to hold it round about where our waist is. Okay, so if you want to bring our arms slightly wider than maybe we normally would if we're holding a bar, okay, and that way the bar should be sat roughly where the waist is. From here, we're performing the exact same movement, and the bar is going to come down to where the knees are, and then we're bringing ourselves back up. Come down to where the knees are, bring ourselves back up. So it's the exact same hinge pattern, except this time, obviously, the bar is being held and it's sliding down to our knees and coming back up. So what we can do is we can go through this assessment, we can look at the same 4 checkpoints. So hip displacement, are them hips traveling back? Knee position, are they staying over the ankles? Bar path, is the bar traveling straight down, straight up, straight down? And finally, trunk position, are we still maintaining good trunk position even when we're holding the stick? If we work through them 4 checkpoints, that's all good. We can move on to the final assessment, which is now going to be the hinge to the shin. So I said when going to the knees, you can have the bar slightly wider. With this one, however, we want to hold it in a neutral grip, so pretty much shoulder width, maybe slightly outside of shoulder width. Okay, so the bar will start just on the thighs, okay, top of the thighs. From here, what the task is, again, it's going to be a 5-1 count, so we're going 5 seconds down, 1 second up. And from here, we're going to be moving the bar down to the mid shins before returning to the top again. 2, 3, 4, 5, push through the floor to stand tall. 3, 4, 5, stand tall. So once again, guys, with this one, we're looking at the same 4 checkpoints. Are the hips traveling back? Are the knees remaining over the ankles? Is the bar path going straight down, straight up? And is the trunk staying in a good position? It's getting harder and harder to do this now because we're obviously increasing that range of motion. As we start to come lower, it's going to be very, very common for us to want to stoop over, and reach down to here. But obviously the task here is to try and keep that trunk position, keep that knee position so the hips are shifting back, and then push through the floor to stand tall again. So once you've worked through them 3 assessments, if you've managed to get through all 3 and you've given them a nice big tick, what you can then start to do is actually look at your performance. Okay, so when looking at performance, what we can do is perform a movement called an RDL, which is essentially hinging to the shin, like we've done here. Okay, you can do that with dumbbells, kettlebells, or a kettlebell or a barbell, whatever you've got access to. Okay, and from here we can perform a 5 repetition maximum. Essentially, it's going to be the most amount of weight that we can lift for 5 really good quality reps. Okay, if you're not able to stick with any of them 4 checkpoints, then you can stop the test, you can reduce the weight and try and find a weight that you can perform the test really, really well. Okay, it's so much more important that you perform immaculately with the points that we've covered than it is about how much weight you've lifted. So you've really got to drop your ego when you do this performance testing, especially in the early stages. So if you perform the assessment correctly, at this point you'll start to be thinking, okay, now I can see why the hinge strengthens the glutes, strengthens the hamstrings. As you're performing the movement, you should really feel good muscular tension around the hamstrings, around the glutes, and especially as you push up as well, you can actually feel quite a bit in the calves. If you're performing the hinge and you're finding that, it's really hurting my back as I'm hinging over, the chances are you are starting to stoop from the back, okay, and not actually displace the hips back. If you displace the hips back, the bar stays in a nice bar path and your trunk stays in a nice position throughout, okay, there's no stooping forwards. It's really unlikely that you're going to feel it in your back unless you've got some prior injury that you're coming into this with. If you are feeling that, it's going to be worth dropping us a message or sending us some videos, and then we can obviously start to maybe look into a little bit more detail about why it might be happening. So now that we've finished the assessment, we can now start to look at the movement adaptations that we can make. So with the hinge, one of the easiest places to start is looking at the range of motion. So as we look through in the assessment, obviously we can hinge down to the knees, okay, or we can hinge down to the shins, or in some cases, if you've got the flexibility, you can also potentially hinge down all the way to something like the ankles, okay, and that's going to put much more of a stretch and really require a greater range of motion around the hips, providing more of a stretch on them hamstring muscles. So changing the range of motion can be quite an interesting task. If you wanted to increase the amount of weight you're lifting, you might want to just, perform a lower to the knees and back up, or if you're trying to work on increasing that range of motion and getting more of a stretch and getting more of a stimulation in them hamstring and glute muscles, then we might be looking at increasing the range of motion. But again, making sure that we're not stooping, we are keeping that nice hip displacement and that nice trunk position throughout. Secondly, we can change the start position. So in the assessments, we showed you about starting from the top. For us, this is the way that we see it easiest to teach at the start. Okay, we find it most easy to sort of understand and learn the hinge starting from the top. But at a certain point, you're going to want to pick heavier stuff up off the floor. Essentially, what might have to happen is you're going to have that barbell or dumbbells or kettlebells, whatever it happens to be, and they might be down on the floor. You've got to get into a good hinge position. and pick that weight up. Next thing you can change is the tempo. Okay, so with our hinge, we can obviously perform, as we showed, a 5-second lower. We can perform pauses in different positions. We can also start to make it maybe a ballistic movement with something like a kettlebell swing or a clean. Some other adaptations you can start to make is what equipment are we using. So I've already discussed the fact that you can use dumbbells or a barbell. Some people have access to trap bars as well, which are a really good bit of kit. And all these different pieces of equipment are going to change how the hinge actually feels. Another way we can play with it, especially for people who really struggle with that hip displacement, is we actually sometimes put a band around the rig or a band around something secure, get our hips in the band, and that way you've got the weights in your hand, the band pulling behind you, and you perform the hinge this way. And it teaches people really well to first sit the hips back, and then as they stand up, really push the hips through. Get a nice contraction through the glutes. Finally, in terms of adaptations, we can also look at changing the body orientation. So obviously we're talking about hinge here where we're stood up. We could also think about hinge where we're leaning over. So there's machines called GHD machines or back extension machines. We can sit our hip crease in the machines, okay? And then from there, we'll hinge down and hinge up with our body parallel to the floor. So we could also think about something like a hip thrust as well. So hip thrust is the opposite way around. So back extension, we're facing down, hip thrust, we're facing upwards. We normally have our back on something like a bench or a low box. And from here, we're driving our hips up into the air and controlling back down. So we're displacing them hips vertically here instead of horizontally, but essentially the movement is still the same. It's still a hip hinge. We've just changed our body orientation. So some key takeaways for the video. Hopefully this video has given you a good foundation of what a hinge actually is, okay, and how you perform it and what the key checkpoints or principles that you're looking out for when you're doing any sort of hinge variation. It should have also given you a step-by-step process to look through for assessing the hinge, and then movements you can use in your training, especially in the early stages when you're getting used to the movement. And then obviously once you feel competent with it and you can hit them checkpoints, you can start to load it and think, right, what is actually my hinge performance? How strong am I in this position with the performance test with the RDL? From there, we've given you some movement adaptations, which should help you to perform the hinge in different circumstances, whatever your anatomy is, whatever your ability is, and whatever equipment you have access to. The video should have covered some good options there for you to have a play around and work with what you've got. And finally, it should have also given you an idea of the practicality of a hinge in your day-to-day life and the sort of things that the movement itself transfers to. So the hinge is an awesome movement, guys. I've seen a lot of people, really transform the strength, but also the pain as well from learning to hinge. A lot of people who, might present with acute or chronic back injuries that will flare up from time to time, just by learning to hinge really, really well, they can be managed much better and they can have a lot less pain, and in some cases, no pain at all anymore, just from learning to hinge and just from learning to actually effectively utilize the hips to bend over as opposed to, just stooping from the back. So it's a really important movement. Again, there's a lot of benefits which we discussed in the purpose at the start. So hopefully you found this video insightful, and I'm looking forward to seeing your hinges.